Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to this sunny JDG session. We're pleased to have Maggie O'Brien and Alexander Whelan with us. So Maggie is a teaching fellow at the University of Edinburgh, and Alexander is a barrister at Fountain Court. And they will speak about hypocrisy.
Thanks. Well, thank you everyone for coming and for having us here today. So we're basically just going to go through the main arguments in our paper in case there are some people who haven't read it. Essentially, our paper is trying to address what we think are really two sort of types of questions that arise in when thinking about hypocrisy. And so the first sort of set of questions is really around what is hypocrisy? Is it wrongful? Is it a feature of hypocrisy? Is the sort of wrongfulness a feature of hypocrisy? Why might we condemn hypocrites? Those kinds of questions, which is a lot about sort of providing an account of hypocrisy. And then the second set of questions, which I think it would be fair to say is really the main interest in our paper, is more around, well, given the kind of charge that hypocrisy is, how should we then use this charge in political debate in particular? And a lot of the philosophical literature tends to be much more around the first kind of set of questions, so it tends to be around the concern about providing an account of hypocrisy. And we sort of started out thinking about it in that way as well, and in particular we started out by really wanting to argue that hypocrisy was not necessarily wrongful. So in other words, to provide a kind of thin account of hypocrisy, and then to sort of branch out from there to thinking about how we might use that term. But in thinking about these issues, we've had a lot of pushback on providing that kind of account of hypocrisy. People's intuitions tend to be very strongly committed to the view that hypocrisy just is wrongful, and so that if you fail to account for the wrongful feature, you're somehow failing to properly provide a proper account of hypocrisy. So as you'll see when we go through it, we haven't fully abandoned our view that hypocrisy is not necessarily wrongful, but it's not really the main focus of the paper, and in fact we think a lot of the argument about whether or not it is wrongful or why actually reveals some of the complexities of the nature of this kind of charge itself, and that has important implications for how we should use it in political debate. So I'm essentially going to address the first part of the paper, which is much more around the nature of hypocrisy, what kind of account can we give of it, what kind of difficulties arise, and then I'm going to hand over to Maggie, who is going to address the sort of second half of the paper, which is about how should we use this charge given the nature of it. So, to start with point one on the handout, we start at this in the sort of first part of the paper to provide an account of hypocrisy. Now, to sort of avoid disappointment, we don't aim to set out a comprehensive account of what this thing is, and the main reason we haven't done that is because, having sort of worked on this idea for quite a while, we think it's incredibly difficult to provide an account of hypocrisy, at least one that sort of tracks the common usage of the term. Now, of course, you may say, well, maybe it's just there is a sort of true account of hypocrisy, and then the term is just being used incorrectly often in public debate. That's sort of one route you could go down. The way that we tend to think about it is actually that the very difficulties of defining what hypocrisy is are sort of an interesting feature of this charge itself. So, if we think about what kind of conduct attracts the charge of hypocrisy, we basically define it as its minimum, that we're looking at a kind of incoherence between a normative claim and some other act or belief or statement that the person's made. Now, by incoherence, we mean a sort of failure of a person's views or actions to hang together in a way that makes sense. So it doesn't have to necessarily be something that's strictly inconsistent, but there's a kind of sort of general sense that there's a failure of things to cohere. And the second part of that sort of minimal definition is that you're looking for something a little bit more than an incoherence, but an incoherence between some sort of action guiding claim and then some other acts, some of your acts or beliefs or statements or things that other things that you've done. Now, that account of hypocrisy, which we set out in the paper, is a thin account. It doesn't assume that hypocrisy on that view is sort of wrongful in any way. As I sort of foreshadowed, many philosophical accounts won't stop there because they think that there must be some additional wrongful feature, and then a lot of the literature in this area is really devoted to trying to figure out what that feature is. So what is the thing that turns some kind of incoherence between an action guiding claim and your other claims or acts from that into hypocrisy? Because and when they say you need something to turn it into hypocrisy, what they're really saying is what makes it wrongful, because most people will say an incoherence on its own isn't sufficient sort of to make you worthy of a kind of damning criticism, which tends to be how the criticism of hypocrisy is regarded. So they're kind of looking for some additional wrongful feature. And so the part of the paper we're thinking about, okay, well, what could that additional wrongful feature be? And there's been quite some interesting sort of psychological studies in how people think about hypocrisy. And one of those studies at Yale sort of posits that essentially that the thing that seems to annoy people about hypocrisy, or sort of make them feel that it's wrongful, is the idea that there's some kind of false claim to moral superiority being made by the hypocrite. And this study sort of has gives rise to two sort of interesting insights. One is that our dislike, sort of psychologically, our dislike of hypocrisy seems to be linked to some kind of unfairness. So the idea that somehow a person's false claim to moral superiority might, for example, make you esteem them better than they actually deserve, and that would be there's some kind of unfairness in that, and that's the kind of thing that's going wrong or that's criticizable in hypocrisy. But the other interesting insight sort of this study reveals is that our dislike of hypocrisy also seems to be connected to our views about what actually counts as the moral high ground. So we tend to dislike people who we perceive to be taking a moral high ground that they don't deserve. But that, of course, means that the way that we tend to think about hypocrisy depends on what we regard to be the moral high ground. So if the person is sort of making some kind of sort of incoherent claims, but what they're doing maybe is actually taking the low road as we would think of it, then people tend not to be sort of concerned about that, or they don't see it as hypocrisy, or they're not worried about that kind of hypocrisy. Now, that's sort of the psychological study, but then when we turn to the philosophical accounts, many philosophers have taken very similar kind of position to this. So we see there's a sort of series of different people who have taken what I would roughly call a kind of moral superiority type view of the wrongfulness of hypocrisy. So the idea that somehow the person who is a hypocrite is kind of perhaps failing to engage in proper self-scrutiny, is sort of evaluating themselves over others in an area or on a topic where they shouldn't do so. And that's sort of one group of people. And then a sort of related but slightly different take is the idea that the sort of wrongfulness of hypocrisy somehow lies in the person being somehow deceptive or insincere, that perhaps, the claims that they're making are not perhaps what they really believe, or it's somehow misleading in that way. Now, we don't in the paper sort of take a position on which one of these accounts really is the right account of the moral wrongfulness of hypocrisy, if there sort of is one. I think in part because it's quite difficult, one of our reasons for scepticism about these various accounts, insofar as they're said to provide a sort of unified account of the moral wrongfulness of hypocrisy, is that these views struggle to account for what we would call the sort of open hypocrite. So it seems to us that while being candid about your sort of hypocrisies and failings can remove a lot of the sort of unfairness or a lot of the reasons to complain about hypocrisy, that person remains a hypocrite. And we give in the paper a sort of example of like the Guilty Feminist podcast, where they're sort of talking about feminists being open about their hypocrisies, but those women are obviously still regard themselves as being hypocrites in terms of some of the views and conduct that they're kind of putting together, but they are sort of talking about it and being open about it. Now, I think for a lot of the people who espouse a sort of thick view of hypocrisy, they would probably think that those women and the sort of open hypocrite doesn't really exist, because once you're very candid and open about your hypocrisy, it's a bit harder to see maybe how you necessarily taking, for example, a position of undeserved moral superiority. It's a bit harder to see how that would actually work. So the key point that we really want to take away from the sort of accounts and the exploration of the various accounts that we do in the first half of the paper is that if you are moved to take a sort of thick view, sort of thick concept of hypocrisy, which in our experience most people are, then when you're trying to identify hypocrisy in the real world, you're looking for both an incoherence between action guiding claim and some other statements, acts, etc., and then also something additional, which is probably going to be connected to the reasons for that incoherence. That's going to give you this kind of extra feature. Now, that is what makes hypocrisy quite difficult to actually identify in the real world, and Maggie's going to talk about this a little bit more. Of course, difficulties identifying hypocrisy in the real world probably don't matter at all, really, if your aim is just to provide the best account of what hypocrisy is. But they do matter if you are sort of coming to what is really our question in the second half of the paper, which is about how we should actually use the charge. Because if it's a sort of feature of the charge itself that it's very difficult to correctly identify, or we're liable to get it wrong, and we'll talk about, and Maggie will talk about this a little bit more, then that should obviously affect how we use that charge. The next point that we sort of address in the first half of the paper is really aimed at, okay, if we have this kind of conduct that I've sort of just talked about, then another sort of related question is, well, why use this charge? What kind of charge actually is it, and what's the sort of effect of using it? Now, we argue in the paper that the charge of hypocrisy is really directed at standing, so it's really a claim that the person who is hypocritical does not have the right to speak or participate in the debate because they are a hypocrite. And so the sort of key way in which this works is essentially that you as the audience or the respondent can sort of dismiss the speaker because of their hypocrisy, but not because of the rightness or wrongness of the actual views that they make. So again, Maggie will address this more, but the point, I suppose, here is that because this is a charge about standing, it's a charge that doesn't engage in the merits or demerits of the sort of issues or claims that are being made, generally. Now, we sort of conclude the first half of the paper just by noting that attacks on standing are often seen to be a very potent tool in political debate, and it's really for this very reason, because they are thought to sort of transcend disagreement about the substance of the debate. So the idea roughly is we can all agree that hypocrisy is bad, we can all maybe agree on what it is, so you and I can agree that this person and their claims should be dismissed because they're a hypocrite, even if we don't agree about the actual claims that they're making. So the example we give in the paper is when you have some areas of deep disagreement, so if we think, for example, some deep disagreement about something like reproductive rights, abortion, the theory with attacks about standing in this context is that, well, the pro-choice and the pro-life person could, in theory, both agree that this advocate for, say, the pro-choice position has no standing to contribute to the debate and should be dismissed, even though because they're a hypocrite, even though they fundamentally disagree about the claim that's being made. So in this sense, it's thought, okay, well, maybe these types of claims can be really useful in political debate because it's a way of perhaps getting agreement sort of across the political aisle about who should contribute or who has the right to contribute, even when we disagree about the substance that's being made. But again, as Maggie will talk about, it's not actually clear whether that proves to be true. So I will hand over to Maggie now, just to sort of sum up that first half of the paper. The sort of points that we're trying to explore there, essentially to sketch a kind of working account of hypocrisy and to highlight at least some of the difficulties that arise when trying to provide that account, and then to sort of sketch out why we actually use this charge and how it works, and the fact that it is a charge about standing, and why that means that it's a kind of particular kind of tool in political debate. And now Maggie is going to speak about how these very features of the charge can raise particular problems.
Yes, so I think one of the things that we're most worried about is that the accusation of hypocrisy is taken to be apt in lots of instances. And those instances where it seems apt are, we think, and we'll try and argue, have very different moral characters, and some of them might be wrong or really wrong, some of them might be totally innocent. But hypocrisy lumps them all together and seems to treat them as though they commit the same type of wrong. So we give this example in the paper, and I'm going to run through it slightly quickly here. So we ask you to imagine a politician who staunchly advocates for greater funding to public schools. By that we mean like free schools. And calls for closure for the fee-paying school system. So she grounds this view, she explains herself by saying that roughly you shouldn't be able to buy access to better education. Now, notwithstanding these publicly stated positions, she sends her child to a fee-paying school. And it seems like, on these bare facts, this politician is a hypocrite, is definitely going to be accused of hypocrisy should this come out. But that case can be explained or filled out in a myriad of different ways that will prove or will show sort of different wrongs or perhaps no wrong at all. So one way that it might have come about, this sort of incoherence, is deception or lying. So the politician knows that it's good for her career or something to say that public schools are the way to go, but she doesn't really hold that view, but she just pretends to hold that view because it will get her support, or that's what her fellow politician party members want her to do. So that seems like not that great, right? We're perfectly happy to say that this person hasn't behaved in a commendable way. Another way is self-deception. So the politician might not be aware that her claim and her act are incoherent or inconsistent. So we ask you to imagine that she sends her child to a fee-paying school that specializes in providing education to students wanting to pursue dance, right? So she believes, let's say in good faith, that this is not the sort of fee-paying school she's targeting when she means what she wants to close down is these sort of elitist academic institutions, not this type of thing. That maybe seems less bad, it's not perfect, but it seems very different than the case of just like out-and-out deception. Another route might be the application of double standards. So the politician thinks that some people, that the education or the principle that education should be publicly funded applies to some people, but not to her. So she might think that she's so special that she deserves this sort of exception. She might think her child is so special that they deserve this exception. Again, it's not exactly clear. Holding double standards, especially if they're unjustified, seems like a bad thing, but again, not exactly of the same moral character of all the other ones we've described. Then it also might be weakness of will. So the politician might wholeheartedly believe in public schools, but she's weak of will. Perhaps her son really begged her to send him to this school. He's really keen on dance, and she just thought, well, okay. Again, weakness of will is a tricky case, very divided in the literature on hypocrisy. Whether or not weakness of will counts or doesn't count is hypocritical. We're not so sure, or what we think, I think. So then another way is that there's no incoherence at all. So the politician believes that the state should act so that public school systems are this type of school systems that we have, but that individuals are free to sort of make their own decisions given the state of play, right? So while she thinks it would be better, and I believe that there should be only public schools, given how the world is right now, especially given perhaps like special duties we have to our children, I'm perfectly justified in sending my child to a fee-paying school. So perhaps on that account, the incoherence entirely dissolves and she's not a hypocrite at all. So what we're trying to show here is that the bare facts of the politician, as I described them in the beginning, she believes in public schools, but she sends her child to a fee-paying school, can be filled out, as we've said, in all these different ways. But a focus and such a condemnation of hypocrisy treats, we think, all of these cases as the same, as committing the same type of wrongfulness. So we think this should give us some serious pause about the use of the accusation if it does, in fact, as we think, treat them all the same. Now, one of the other difficulties that comes with hypocrisy, we think, is that even if you can agree on some extra feature of what it is that makes the incoherence wrong, identifying incoherence accurately is very tricky. So as we said in the beginning, or as we just said now rather, the politician case might be explained such that there is no incoherence. We're not very good at figuring out what counts as incoherence. We often have to have lots of information that we probably don't have. And it seems pretty true that there isn't going to be anything wrong with just an apparent incoherence, right? But the accusation is often leveled at the near site of incoherence, this sort of surface level. And then the psychological research that Alex referred to in the beginning gives us even more reason to be worried about how we characterize other people's conduct. And the basic, takeaway is that we're more likely to see hypocrisy in our enemies or in our foes than we are in our friends. So, so for the feminist who sees a woman, or the feminist who sees another feminist wearing high heels or wearing makeup, she's perfectly likely to see that as a case of internalized patriarchal norms, or perhaps the woman making a completely rational choice given the way the world is, and sort of not see that as a case of hypocrisy. She will explain it away to some extent. But then the person who's hostile to feminism is totally likely to call hypocrisy when, he hears or she hears of a woman engaging in some sort of anti-feminist behavior, or what we might describe as anti-feminist. So what we're trying to say here is that we're really likely to misidentify who's a hypocrite and who's not a hypocrite. Often we won't have all of the details available to us, and we'll say perhaps we shouldn't have all the details available to us. And our sort of psychological propensity to misidentify it, again, we should be really worried about it. And as Alex said, the stakes seem pretty high for getting hypocrisy right, because many people think that we're justified in silencing them and ignoring them, dismissing them without engaging in their claims. Okay, so that's sort of a basic worry that we have about hypocrisy, and then we have specific worries about the use of this accusation in political debate. So as Alex was saying, one of the sort of key good or powerful things about the accusation is that it's supposed to speak across political aisles, right? We all hate hypocrites, and we all think that they should not be able to contribute. But again, the psychological research doesn't really bear this out. What it seems to show is that accusations of hypocrisy just sort of harden people who already didn't like them, even further, but that people who are more sympathetic to their claims, again, are likely to explain it away. And it's worth sort of, we think, stressing that this psychological research fits nicely with what we want to say about hypocrisy, which is that it's this sort of amorphous concept that does seem to be readily manipulable and can be explained away or made more salient in certain cases. So that's one worry, is that it just doesn't do the thing people think it does. It doesn't transcend the debate. It just hardens up those divisions. The other thing, another sort of worry, which is probably obvious, is that hypocrisy doesn't tell us the right or wrong thing, right? The indulgence of luxury taste tells us nothing about the merits of socialism or something like this, right? So accusations of hypocrisy at Champagne Socialists, for example, don't really help us figure out whether we should be egalitarian or not. Now, this probably seems like a fairly obvious point, but we want to stress that while the claim isn't made to directly engage with the substance, it often masquerades as like a knockdown argument against the side who has the hypocrites, right? So you're not just encouraged to dismiss the person who's the hypocrite. In lots of cases, you're encouraged to dismiss that view. It's something like, those people are all hypocrites, therefore there must be something wrong with that view, right? I think, and this seems really worrying, right? It's an attempt to decide the debate, to determine the debate without engagement in the substance of the claims. So those are some worries. How are we for time? Okay. 5 minutes? Okay, I'll be quick. So we also think, so in a recent article, Jessica Isero and Colin Klein think about, like us, they sort of take seriously how we use hypocrisy in the real world and who tends to be accused of it. But unlike us, they seem to be keen on the threatening use of the accusation of hypocrisy. In part, it seems like they think that it will soften moral discourse. So our fear of being accused of hypocrisy, they think, is likely to make us less condemnatory or less judgy, to put it sort of roughly. But I think it's probably clear from what we say. We take a very different view. We don't think that charges of hypocrisy are likely to soften moral discourse. We think they're going to be spurious, and we think also that given the way liberal democracies are sort of set up, they seem to incentivize a little hypocrisy, and as we say, it's not clear to us that a world without hypocrisy would be necessarily a better world. So why do we think liberal democracies encourage some hypocrisy? Well, I'm going to go through this slightly quickly, but we're happy to talk about it a bit more. But one thing we think is that liberal democracies, seemingly by their very nature, encourage and promote a lot of compromise. Compromise, in just trying to make deals with maybe different political parties, compromises between different roles we have, compromises between who we are in public and who we are in private. And we don't know that our quickness to condemn hypocrisy really takes into account the ways in which we have to be civil and compromise. It seems perhaps we are too quick about that. We also think that there's sort of more mundane ways in which liberal democracies encourage hypocrisy. It seems to us that the tone of political debate really encourages this wholehearted condemnation on one side or on the other, enthusiastic endorsement, right? And it doesn't leave a lot of room for nuance or what we might say are sophisticated views, right? Nuance gets translated into wishy-washiness, and instead we want someone who's got a clear, so-called clear position. Also, the use of rhetoric and aspirational claims and sort of motivating people and maybe inspiring hope can often be helpful in political debate, but inevitably people with big aspirational claims fall short of those, and again we see them as hypocrites, or we're likely to. Another reason someone might become a hypocrite is because they want to tell you what you should do because they have made or the same mistake you might be about to make, right? So the hypocrite, because of that very mistake that they've made, might be especially well placed to inform you or to advise you as to what you should do, right? So they have this sort of extra knowledge. Someone who writes about this is McAllister Bell, and she's quite interested in the fact that the hypocrite seems to have an extra reason to be the one speaking rather than a reason not to speak. Maybe I'll just say one more thing. So we'll close with this. A focus on hypocrisy seems to imply that you could undo the incoherence in any old way, and that would be good, right? So I tell my children, don't text and drive, but I text and drive myself. It seems like when we fixate on hypocrisy, it's not clear, it's not obvious that I would do, that I do better by undoing or not doing my telling of my children, or by no longer texting and driving. It seems like the focus on hypocrisy makes those equally good options for undoing the incoherence, but that is plainly not the case. You only do better in that scenario by stopping texting and driving yourself, rather than giving up your guidance, your claims to tell your children what to do. And so we think that a focus on hypocrisy loses track of this. I think we'll end
Thanks so
it there.
much.
Yeah.